Good afternoon, and thank you for watching Law News Network. I'm Laura Nanos, your host, and we're watching the Adrian Loya trial up in Massachusetts today. This is the murder trial of a Coast Guard officer who has been accused of murdering a fellow officer and attempting to murder that officer's wife. What we're going to do today, we've just seen on the stand for several hours Dr. Martin Kelly. He is a forensic psychologist. He's kind of an interesting witness because he's a witness for the prosecution, but at least in my opinion, almost everything he's saying seriously helps the defense. This is an unusual trial in that the defense is not simply that the defendant, Adrian Loya, didn't do it, but rather that he's not guilty by reason of insanity. And the crux of that insanity plea for this case is that Adrian Loya suffers from Asperger syndrome. And we're going to look a little bit more at Dr. Kelly's testimony about what that might mean, what it could mean for this case, who it's helping, and how accurate it might be, as well as how it might play for the jury. We're going to be joined in a little while by Ashton Schwinn, who is a LawNewz Network employee. She's someone that works with us on our trial watching, and she herself is an adult with Asperger syndrome. So she's going to give us kind of an expert's view into how she thinks this defense could play before the jury. Before we do that, we're just going to catch you up on a little bit of what happened this morning. This is some testimony from earlier today, and when we come back, we'll be with you with Ashton Schwinn.
All right, so I was thinking about, this past June, when I started thinking about it. I was, it was just incredibly crazy what I was planning to do. It's fucking crazy that I want to conduct a mission to go murder a girl and die. It's not exactly the healthiest stuff. All right. So I was thinking about it in June. I came to my decision that I was going to do it. Start planning it now. But I started thinking about it and realized, I was like, hey, you know what? I want you to destroy my career. I have suicidal thoughts. I have murderous thoughts. You know what? We'll make this get some help. There goes the music. Because I started doing the airsoft thing, and it's training for when the day comes, to understand, what it's like to, really, video game that get targets, really see what's around, carry it, but it's fun. It's, most people it is fun to be, play soldier. I think being an actual soldier would suck ass. It's probably called horrible, but playing soldier on the weekends, weekend warrior stuff, it's fun. That's what I haven't eaten today. I've just been drinking an energy drink. I think it's a Monster Recovery, the pink lemonade one. I don't want to really go through this right now. I've had a couple attacks with this. I never had it before in my life until now. But there's only been 3 bad ones. And now it's the very, very first one, where I was in the bathroom. And the other one was when, after I had the top of Mr. Ryan, I was crying in there, and then we finally let me go. I went back to the Frisco's. I was still all messed up, crying. And I realized I had to get out of there, so I got my running gear, put my running gear on, and started driving out to Abercrombie. And then, as I left the base, got onto Reznov, I started crying again really hard. Because that really horrible style of crying. Whereas before in Mr. Ryan's office, when I was crying, it was sad crying or whatever. In the car, it's the PTSD crying type, where I can't breathe, but I start hyperventilating. Chest is really tightened up, and tears aren't pouring out, but I'm gritting my teeth, trying to, I'm breathing through my mouth and gritting my teeth, and that started happening. And as I was starting to enter town, up before that, right before 10 minutes curve, my left side, my left arm, started really tingling badly, and that's never happened before. Started tingling, and it was weird sensation. It started going numb. So then, as I started driving to town, going towards the hospital. As you enter town, you take a right and start going to the hilly part of the road that goes through town. And I was messed up. I was like, I started laughing a bit because I was like, oh no, I'm having a heart attack. I don't know if I could never had a heart attack. My rib died. So your left side starts going numb or something. So like, well, this is it. This is how Adrian Loya goes down through all these events. And it's because he had a heart attack after just crying because some old man was talking shit to him, basically. And ran away crying. And now he's having a heart attack on the road. It's probably gonna happen and things are crashing. So then I started subsiding. Since I was laughing, coming at ease a bit. So I got to Abercrombie, immediately started going for a jog, started, cooled down. Then got to my little lookout spot, and then I just stopped and I sat there. I teared up and cried a little bit more, but it wasn't bad. Then after several, maybe half an hour or so, started running back to jogging back to the car. When I got there, Frisco's are there, Harvey's there, and they wanted to know what happened. I did text them. I texted them, texted Mr. Egan, texted the one-on-one, what's it called? She's like a sighted person after you have a sexual assault case or check in on you. So Saturday night I was having the arm tinglings and something was wrong. I just been yelled at by Mr. Ryan and it's feeling horrible. So.
Welcome back. I'm Laura Nanos. Thanks for watching Law News Network on this Wednesday. We are watching the Adrian Loya murder trial, and on the stand today has been forensic psychologist Dr. Martin Kelly. And Dr. Kelly has largely been on the stand to discuss with us the symptomology of Asperger syndrome as it relates specifically to this defendant. And as we're talking about that, we have an excellent resource here at Law News Network. We have Ashton Schwinn with us. Ashton is a LawNewz staffer. She's also an adult with Asperger syndrome. Hi, Ashton. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Ashton, as an adult who also has Asperger syndrome, and I realize, of course, that this is not a one-size-fits-all issue, that not every single person on the spectrum has the same experience as any other person, I think it's important, though, to talk with someone who lives in this world and to talk about Dr. Kelly's testimony, some of the things that he has said, and I'd love to get your reaction on them. And the first thing I want to ask you is, how do you think having Asperger syndrome might affect someone who has been accused or involved with a violent crime?
Well, I personally don't think that having Asperger's itself is going to make someone run out and commit a murder or do whatever. I believe that it's something that could happen. It's not necessarily I have Asperger's, so I'm going to go kill somebody. So,
sure, that makes perfect sense, of course, and I think that would be the case for any kind of disorder, a mental disorder, a physical disorder. You know, just because someone has a particular condition certainly doesn't mean that they're going to become a criminal because of it. That being said, there are many reasons and many situations where a person who does have some kind of mental defect or mental disease or disorder is, under the law, not guilty for a crime because whatever their mental issue is prevented them from having the requisite intent. And that is what this defendant is claiming here. The defense here is not that Adrian Loya didn't do it or didn't kill this victim, but rather that he shouldn't be held responsible because he was not able to form the right kind of intent because he had Asperger syndrome. The first thing I want to ask you about that is Dr. Kelly on the stand, and from my point of view, he's got a difficult job because one of the things that he's doing is he has to educate all these jurors about Asperger's and the autism spectrum, just with a couple of hours of testimony, and that's difficult. And I think that for the most part, he's doing a pretty okay job of educating these people about the basics of that disorder. But one of the things that has come up, and you and I were talking about this, is that several times Dr. Kelly referred to Asperger syndrome as a disease. And I'm interested to hear, what do you think about that?
My reaction every time I hear somebody say that is, I have autism, I don't have the plague. So I don't see it as something, a disease, where a disease might be something that you could give somebody, but in this case it's a disorder, and unfortunately I tend to focus on that when I hear somebody say it, so I'll correct them 50 billion times until they finally say it right. But that to me as a person, yes, that is very irritating to have somebody say it's a disease.
I can certainly understand that, because of course when we use the word disease, the connotation that goes with that word is that this is something contagious, this is something a person can contract, and it's not just who the person is or how they were formed to begin with. And I think that that is a really important distinction. But I wonder if this, and as a clinical psychologist, as a forensic psychologist, this doctor has to know that. If he has worked with people on the spectrum, he has to know that using the word disease to describe Asperger syndrome or any other part of the autism spectrum is, let's say, a disfavored way of describing the disorder. So it makes me wonder, he lives in this world, he worked in this world, he's using a term that really very few people in that world use. I'm wondering if maybe he's using the word disease because it helps legally as in the defense. The more he describes it as something really bad, the more likely it is to be an excuse for this particular defendant.
And I agree with that. That's how I saw it when I was listening to the testimony, was that it's almost like he's trying to build it up in the eyes of the jury, who may or may not be aware of what autism is, what the spectrum's about, how it can, he's making it look really, really bad. And that's the whole thing he needs to be doing, is make it look really, really bad in the eyes of the jury.
Yeah, and I think that this is really interesting because this witness is a prosecution witness. However, pretty much everything he said has helped the defense. He's gotten on the stand, he has said that he believes that this defendant, because of having Asperger syndrome, is unable to tell the difference between right and wrong. clearly he's really a defense witness, even though he is technically on the prosecution's witness list. And this person has testified many times in the past, so it's not unusual to think he is well rehearsed, and he knows that using words like disease may really bolster that defense.
And then by also stating that he doesn't know right from wrong. I've been on the spectrum. I just turned 50 the other day, and I have known since I was little that it's not okay to do certain things. And, you know, when I got old enough, I started learning thou shalt not kill. So,
Ashton, that actually brings me kind of to a point that I'd like to see if you agree with. So my understanding of people who are on the autism spectrum is that, in fact, as a group, these are people who often tend to follow rules more than the average person. Because of the rigidity associated with autism spectrum disorders, that in fact many people on the autism spectrum, or people who have Asperger syndrome, tend to be rule followers, tend never to get in trouble in school, tend to never have interactions with law enforcement. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct, yes. I have a son, I have actually two sons who are both on the spectrum as well, and my youngest is very much against breaking the rules of any kind, and one of the things that he hates the worst is when the entire classroom gets in trouble for what one student did. He has been sent, one time he was sent to the principal because he reacted badly to having to have somebody else's punishment, but we explained it to him and he did better and accepted it. He doesn't like it, but he was able to accept that that's just how schools go. And I myself also very much rule follower, and if I get off track on the rules, I tend to get a little bit panicky. So I have to have that straight. I have to find that, have the guideline.
Yeah, thank you so much. That actually, I think, puts a interesting filter on this. And I'll tell you that one of the things that you just described, having a child who also is on the spectrum, who basically you're describing what I would call a reaction to injustice, right? And from what I know also about individuals on the spectrum, that the idea of injustice is something that can be very difficult to cope with because of that propensity to follow rules.
Yes, very much so. It can cause a disruption in the rules for the child, who then has to regroup and refocus and may have meltdown. He had a pretty big meltdown over that one, and there were a lot of things said that were kind of scary, but we talked him through it, and he's had it happen again. And the next time he had it was much better. So yes, rules are, as I get older, I find it easier to bend the rules a little more than when I was little. And I think he's becoming that way as well. He's learning that he doesn't have to necessarily always have it this one way. He can maybe let something change a little bit and still be okay.
Yeah, and I think that those are really important insights. I want to turn to this case. So in this case, one of the sort of story that the defense is putting forward is that Adrian Loya fancied himself a victim. Now, whether or not he actually was a victim is really not the point. In his mind, according to the defense, he was a victim. And in his mind, the Coast Guard didn't do the right thing. And he was not only the victim of an assault, but he was then the victim of injustice. And in his mind, the system failed, and law enforcement, the Coast Guard, no one really was there to do the right thing. And the doctor testified earlier that based on some things that he knew about Loya, that Loya fancied himself to be something of a hero, that he was more interested in doing the right thing and being heroic than, for example, in being violent, which was why he may have chosen the Coast Guard as opposed to the Army or the Marines. And if it's true that, and of course we don't know what was going on inside his mind, but if it was true that he really believed that he was the victim of an injustice, would it make sense to you that because of his Asperger's, he might think that it's his responsibility to go and end that injustice by killing this victim?
I can see that to an extent, as far as right the right, do the right thing, that kind of thing. But I don't know. I just really struggle with whether or not his need to fix things because he was victimized is a legitimate thing for autism. Is autism the reason that he needs to go and fix this? Is it? I don't really see that as I would say no on that. No, I think that, to me, seems like he kind of has done some studying on what autism is, and so he's saying, or what's being portrayed, or things that, hey, I've got autism is this, so I need to do this. And very much there is an aspect to autism, however, that is victimization that can be. My son has an issue with that, and I have it in my past as well. A lot of victimizing, but I've never thought about going out and fixing it as far as offing somebody. I've cut people out of my life, but I've never actually, killed someone.
I wonder if the type of awareness that this case or cases like this could bring about ASD and Asperger syndrome, I wonder if it could be something of a double-edged sword. So if we have a doctor here testifying and educating these jurors about what Asperger syndrome is and how it functions, how it might affect this person, if in fact Adrian Loya is found not guilty by reason of insanity, because a jury believes that his Asperger syndrome prevented him from following the law in some way, is that something that could hurt the autism community overall?
I think it could give the wrong impression in the awareness aspect of autism. It could show, that person over there's got autism. Well, he would just make off me or something like that. But I would hope that the jury, and I would hope that the community would be more aware of the fact that just because somebody is on the spectrum doesn't necessarily mean that they are more inclined to do something that he's being accused of or whatever. And is it going to cause an issue in the community? I don't see it could, but I don't think it will. I think that the more we speak out, the more we make the world aware of what it is to be on the spectrum, and the more people understand us, they can see that the spectrum is very wide.
Sure, and I think that that's an important point, because in this case, even if Adrian Loya does have Asperger syndrome, that in and of itself doesn't explain anything, because he could be a person with Asperger syndrome who knew the difference between right and wrong, or a person with Asperger syndrome who did not know the difference between right and wrong. It's a wide spectrum. People have very different experiences, different symptoms, different abilities. So explaining that he has a disorder is not the end of the story. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And I think that's really important here. I have one more question that I kind of want to delve into with you, which is, for a person who is torn, okay, for a person who is facing a difficult choice, for example, the choice between following the law and doing what that person thinks is right. Many of us face these choices in life where the law says to do one thing, but we know that maybe something else is more moral or better to do. And those can be difficult choices for anyone. But are those choices particularly difficult for someone on the spectrum?
For me, yes. That is, I am a major law abider. I drive the speed limit. I do everything the way what the law tells me. There are times when, you have that thought in the back of your head that says, well, maybe they don't know what they're talking about. Maybe my way is better. And it also, that can also be someone who's more on the spectrum, higher up on the spectrum, may have more issues with differentiating. However, a lot of times what the law says is the way it should be. And I've had issues with my husband and his driving. No, honey, we must drive the speed limit so that we do not get another ticket.
And that's a perfect example of, driving the speed limit and the law says to drive a certain way, but there might be situations where it's actually safer to drive, exceeding the speed limit or driving outside whatever the rules are. And that's a perfect example of difficult choices that we make every day.
Yes, I'm a stickler. If it says 60, I drive 60. If it says, I can go over that a little bit, I will only go over that a little bit. The flow of traffic thing always baffles me sometimes, because it's like, why isn't everybody just driving 60? That's what the speed limit is. And my husband, of course, is lead foot a little bit, and he will drive pretty much anything, and he's really good about that. But for me, no. It's got, I can probably drive him crazy with that.
So, I think that this is going to be an interesting thing to see as this trial plays out, and as we hear more from the defense, the difference between, whether or not Dr. Kelly's testimony really is going to help or hurt Adrian Loya, because certainly some people are going to say that if he had Asperger's, he would be more likely to follow the law. But at the same time, there's an argument to say that if he had Asperger's, he might have a reason to have committed this crime, in his mind, as a way of being heroic or as a way of fighting some kind of injustice. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how having Asperger syndrome plays into this defense. And, we'll have to see, what happens as we hear more testimony, as we hear from people who really knew him well, and we'll see kind of how that plays out. Ashton, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I think your insight has been really valuable. We really appreciate your time with us today, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.